Well, thank you very much for inviting me as well to the BAAL TEASIG seminar. This talk is actually a version of what I delivered for ILTA YL SIG last year. So if you went to that one, then this is going to look a bit similar, but at the end, I'm going to talk about standard setting a bit more. So what I'd like to do in this talk is to talk about the relevance of the CFR, but also how how it can be used in terms of learning, teaching and assessment of young learners. The CFR is context and target language and age agnostic, we know that. So it's compatible with any context, not restricted to adults learning English in a formal private language learning context, obviously. And as a framework for language proficiency, it's useful to profile all language curricula and instruction assessment within its interpretive framework. So young learners' courses, learning progression and assessment can be profiled, obviously, within the CFR. As long as their cognitive differences as well as social emotional development are taken into account in task design and aspects of test development, test administration, and even in the assessment criteria. I think Wenjun's talk previously was a very good example of how task design and can affect the young learners' performance on a task. So the CFR has been used, obviously, in various ways. It's been adopted to inform and evaluate young learners' curricula and to set targets, achievable targets in instruction. The content standards that the CFR represents have been adapted to develop age-appropriate performance level descriptors to guide teaching and learning. And these performance descriptors are mainly used in self-evaluation in the classroom. But most importantly, the CFR has been used and instrumental in designing new young learners tests and to align to its content and performance standards, but also to set cut scores. And this is what I'd like to concentrate on eventually in this talk, in order to facilitate interpretation of test scores in results reports. So I just wanted to show you this slide that everything has been done. So alignment of two curricula to compare curricular aims is possible and has been done. Teaching and learning with curricula assessment, with assessment for conversion tables, and then CFR standards. The standards of the CFR have been used to align curricula, for example, even in various first language and second language curricula and literacy curricula have been aligned in the UNICEF Education in Emergencies Learning Passport. I don't know if you are aware of that, 2020, that actually used the CFR as well to inform curricula in emergency contexts, which was actually used during the COVID in some contexts. In teaching and learning, the CFR has been used to collate the YL descriptors from the European language portfolios by Tim Goodyear. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And to develop and calibrate CFR-related descriptors to guide teaching and learning, which is, for example, the Pearson Learning Objectives, Young Learner Learning Objectives project, but also to inform assessment of writing and reading in the ALIT project. The CFR has also been obviously used in assessment to confirm the targeting of a test. So, for example, young learners' tests at Cambridge English were confirmed as the very first alignment study carried out in 2008. And then also the CFR has been instrumental in aligning tests to facilitate already existing tests, to facilitate interpretation of test scores, as in the TOEFL primary and junior test cases. So I'd like to talk about the standard setting and cut score methodology in terms of Zeke's categorization of the age of innocence, which he said was this long age of innocence in standard setting methodology ended in the 1960s because there was almost no attention paid how standards were established and how cut scores were set. This doesn't mean that they didn't exist, cut scores and standard setting, but they were not object of research. And then the next age, the age of awakening, was mainly related to the emergence of the criterion referenced assessment in the 1990s. And a huge amount of publications appeared on standard setting and cut scores then. And according to Kaftandieva, the CFR in language assessment played a role of an alarm clock, as she says, which announced the end of the age of innocence, according to Zeke's classification, and set the beginning of the age of awakening in the area of setting cut scores in language, for in-language testing in Europe. So for me, the age of, these are my 4 young learners, by the way. For me, the age of innocence was when I started my PhD in second language acquisition in 1994, exactly when Zeke was writing his article. And then the awakening was when I joined Cambridge English and we had to carry out the first standard setting and study on a young learners test in 2007-8. And then 10 years after the introduction of those tests. And at the moment, I am obviously in the era of realistic acceptance. So the age of, I'm going to go through these very quickly. So the curriculum, as I see it, is represents the age of innocence. So basically using the CFR as the basis of curriculum development, because it is a sequenced and staged learning progression. So it has been used, it's cumulative learning ladder, as I say, has been used in to chart our development within course materials, within curricula. However, as we also saw in Renjun's presentation, what we need is empirically validated developmental sequencing, long-term, longitudinal studies really on how different young learner age groups progress in their learning and development within each context, EFL, ESL, and EAL, all the different. Why is this important? Why is it interesting? Because you can chart out critical paths for high achievers. So those paths where the learning would be the most effective. Right. So what we need is what the CFR itself recommends is planning backwards from the needs of young learners in a particular context. What we have to help us with is not just the CFR itself and the companion volume, but also Tim Goodyear's collection of European language portfolios. European language portfolios. Here he is giving video presentation of how the CFR descriptors from the companion volume from 2018 were used to see the relevance of the European language portfolios, for which there is about 100 of them, more than 100 of them, to categorize descriptors, whether they are relevant for young learners at different age groups, 7 to 10 and 11 to 15. So the CFR, these young learners descriptors are useful for planning and self-evaluation, as I said. When we use them, we need to take into account the cognitive challenge, development, the learner experience in context, and the educational context features. Oops, sorry. I don't want to play any clip now because we don't have time. So what is significant about the CFR and especially the companion volume, I'd like to point out that these are very useful because they are related to new skills which incorporate mediation and online interaction, which underline integrated multimodal communicative practices that are relevant for the lives of young children and will be relevant for the lives of young children. So these new added skills in the CEFR companion volume describe old skills in new ways. So for example, collaborative problem solving, contributing to a shared understanding, helping others to understand, so relaying information in terms of mediation are skills that young learners need, and we need to find ways of incorporating these new constructs into young learner curricula and assessment. Right, so in terms of target setting, the CFR is very, very useful because, and also it can, but what we need to make sure that the targets are achievable and attainable and realistic. So this is where you'll see that the age of awakening and disillusionment may have come in. For some people, we know that the target for A1, according to Tim, was at the end of primary and beginning of secondary interface, A1, which is a very low level. And he originally said that A2 is realistic to expect by around 14, B1 by 16, and B2 by 18. And the ALI project verified the target attainable level for 10 to 12-year-olds as A1, in fact. However, we also have some other more ambitious targets which have been explained in contexts, especially where we are talking about either immigration context, so where learners are ESL or EAL learners, or even in bilingual contexts where children are learning through the medium of English. So, for example, Hasselgreen and Cordwell set much higher expectations for young learners. So young children between 6 and 9, they say, should achieve A2 or are potentially could achieve A2. Older children B1 between 9 and 13. Anyway, so you can see that the target setting is actually quite an important, but it has to be realistic. These targets are usually speculative, and as I say, not based on empirical research on what is actually achieved and sequences of development in particular contexts. So they are still just speculative. So in terms of teaching and learning, the awakening and disillusionment, I think, comes in especially this, that the targets that are achievable on the ground are not as high as what we would like to see. And that's probably because usually teachers need to deal with mixed ability classes. So because of the age, the grouping of children in terms of age and the high variability within, for example, an 8 to 9-year-old group makes it quite difficult for teaching, and makes individualized teaching quite important in the young learner classroom. Sorry. Okay, I'm not clicking on one device. So teachers would probably agree that teachers always agree that individualized assessment and teaching would be best solution. But still, the scope and sequencing within the CFR is relevant here because the learning ladder can be actually used to target different groups within a classroom, for example. So the average learners for example, who are typically developing, and then the ones who are struggling, and the ones who are overperforming or exceeding the target, for example. So these scope and sequences are very, very important in the CFR because we can identify the right emphasis and the expected rates of growth. And teachers actually have quite a lot of experience in how much learning gain can be achieved within a year, for example, and predictable sequencing. So as we can see, there are lots of materials which have been even adapted or revised, in fact. So they have been revised to make sure that the scope and sequencing is correct within CFR terms, and learning outcomes, specific learning outcomes may have been added to some materials, and activities typically conducted in classrooms also, like listening and repeating words, for example, or reading assessment tasks, reading a text and completing sentences by filling in gaps. They have been, so these materials have been revised, classroom materials. So for example, by CUP, Hello English, Kidsbox and Power Up and Open World, those are materials that have been actually pegged to the CFR, and they have been revised in terms of their scoping and sequencing. So there is another project that I wanted to draw your attention to. So, for example, the AILIT project early on offered teachers guidelines for the assessment of pupils' writing, and that was a very groundbreaking study, because they very helpfully included handwritten samples at different CFR levels for teachers' comments and how to demonstrate how teachers can use the assessment scales that was offered there, developed and offered, to feedback to pupils. Right. So I just want to mention a couple of other studies. So Cambridge IGCSE, again, that was it came as an awakening, really, to me anyway, that the level in the IGCSE Cambridge qualification as an addition, English as an additional language, is actually quite low. It's only level A2, and with some elements of level B1, which is this screen. So this is Cambridge IGCSE, which targets A2 and with some elements of B1, and even more shocking for me was that not just Cambridge IGCSE as English as a second language, but other modern foreign languages, in this case GCSE French, German and Spanish, were measured in terms of the CFR, and what was the findings show that the level is actually quite low. So A2 at grade 7, and at grade 9 is there is a bit of a requirement to reach elements of B1 level performance. So I think this just shows, okay, just the last study I'd like to mention is this study on what level learners in an immersion or learning history and mathematics, for example, need in terms of English level. And here what Finnish colleagues have found is that in terms of the CFR, 14-year-old learners would need B1 to succeed in history and mathematics, and then 15-16-year-old students would need B2 competence in the same skills. So in terms of assessment, so we are coming to the age of realistic acceptance. So it is, the CFR is very relevant, as I said, because it describes the construct, and what Brian North also recommends is that what needs to be done is profiling of young learner performance. So, for example, in terms of B1 performance, you might expect young learners to be able to demonstrate some of these skills, that sub-skills that are described in the CFR, not all of them. And that's just how they would be, because some of the skills are not relevant for them, for example. Right, so, okay, so what to assess is the question, because some of the skills are relevant, as I say, and some are not so relevant in terms of, for example, yeah, so work-related skills like telephoning, for example. I can't see how children would need to have that skill. So the task is to develop a range of cognitively and linguistically appropriate. Okay, sorry, I'm just clicking on my, okay, so what to assess? So the challenge is to develop a range of cognitively and linguistically appropriate instructional and assessment tasks, which are relevant, but not too frustrating for children, and graded in terms of difficulty and variety. And these tasks need to be overlapping, just like in an overlooking structure within the CFR, to be able to track progression and development. So that once we have identified the targets, which are SMART, so realistic and achievable, then, and we have selected and developed an age-appropriate and well-targeted test, then the next task is to setting the standards. So establishing credible and meaningful cut scores which determine the achievement or performance that reflect mastery or attainment of what we are trying to measure. So we must consider and define for this what we call the minimally competent candidate at each target level. And I'd like to talk about this minimally competent candidate, minimally competent learner. So how do we define this minimally proficient or competent learner? Sometimes it's called the borderline test taker or just qualified candidate. So the CFR, thankfully in English, the CFR, so research on the CFR, and particularly English, includes the notion of criterial differences, and that helps us to differentiate one level from another. So for example, what I mean by these criteria differences, so linguistic and functional features can be identified which differentiate between different levels of the CFR. So for example, I listed some features that are demonstrated by barely qualified B1 learners, minimally competent B1 learners. So they would make mistakes between subject-verb agreement, for example, modal auxiliary use, question formation, negative formation, and that is just what typically barely qualified minimally competent B1 learner does. And we know this because there have been studies carried out on within English grammar profile and English vocabulary profile that are empirical and that provide empirical evidence that this is the case. So how do we okay, I need to go back. So yeah, so this minimally competent candidate, the notion is very helpful even for children, for example. So we can tell a child wanting to go on a ride in a fairground, that you must be this tall to go on this ride, but it might be more helpful for the child plus the parent and the teacher even, that we say you need to grow this much to go on this ride. So what the child needs to be able to achieve, rather than how much, how tall they need to be. So we can actually tell them about next steps that they need to improve on to be able to qualify for the next level. And this is what criteria features are useful for, but also for in terms of standard setting and finding the right cut scores in a test. So the minimally competent learner needs to be agreed upon when it comes to standard setting. So in a new test, or in a test that is being aligned to the CFR, there is usually a panel of judgments, panel of experts who make judgments on where the distinction is between the different levels of the CFR. So I'm just showing you in this long text is a panel, a recent panel exercise to find cut scores, how a consensus can be arrived at and actually written down on what the minimally competent candidate within a primary school setting at each level of the CFR is can be expected or would be expected to do and perform. So this consensus-based written description is extremely important, and the judges, the panel members need to agree on this and understand this shared standard of the minimally competent candidate. And that is actually based on a lot of consideration of task difficulty and cognitive development and what can be expected of a child. I don't have time to go through actual tasks now, I think, but even in Wenjung's presentation, we could see what makes it difficult for children to express, their thoughts in terms of when they have limited linguistic resources. Right, so I'm just going to talk about listening and reading tasks. So Ali Moi already in 2009 said that standard setting actually can be very useful to find out what is easy and difficult for a particular group of candidates in connection with reading, for instance, and tell us something about reading competence, what is acquired early and what is acquired late in language learning process, and what strong, weak and weak learners are able to do. So here she was actually only talking about A2 and B1 level tasks, and within a group of borderline candidates who were assessed as borderline between two levels, between A2 and B1. So she could identify items which were easy for this borderline group and which were difficult. So standard setting, similarly, a different study a bit later by Zeidler, who also, these researchers also try to think about what makes the minimal competent person in a standard setting environment, and how what features of the tasks in particular and task performance would make a minimally competent candidate at B1, what would be typical or characteristic of a minimally competent candidate at B1 level, what features of the task would make them. So it's within standard setting, as I say, it's very important, and because of the limitations that children and young learners have, teenagers as well, have in terms of working memory and Okay, especially in working memory, they are relevant for setting the relevant cut scores. So, okay, back to setting how to establish the cut scores. So we know that Zeke's age of innocence was characterized by determining cut scores in vaguely normative ways. So the first was, as Kostantieva says, that it was as if it was by tradition that the cut score will be 70% correct items because it has always been like this. So that was one way of justifying cut scores. And then authority would be the cut score will be 60% correct items because I think it should be, yeah. So that would be based on authority, but again, not by empirical judgment. And then Kostantieva also added the Goldilocks method, and she said that the cut score will be 80% correct items because 70% is too little and 90 is too much. But so these are the ways of how cut scores used to be determined, but in the criterion reference era that we are living now, performance and content standards, such as the CFR, are make the job of finding cut scores not easier, but much more meaningful and defensible. So what I'm showing here is the results of the study the test I showed earlier. So this test that was developed, a linear test that was developed for lower primary and upper primary, lower secondary and upper secondary school learners between the ages of 8 and 16. So the results show that there are differences between the different school sectors. But then what the task was is actually finding cut scores for each school sector and also for each CFR band, yeah, because the test was designed to test between pre-A1 and B1, but then how do you get from this right map to the cut scores? And that can be done by, as I said, a level setting panel. So the level setting panel usually contains between 7 to 12 judges, but sometimes even more. And they need to be, these panelists need to be trained in the CFR as well as the method that has been chosen for the standard setting. So usually the method is either the Angoff method or the bookmark method for objective items like listening and reading. And they need to be taught they need to be trained how to make the judgment. So they need to be showed examples, and then there need to be some training on some items, and then there need to be some practice. And then the way I've just done it recently with a group of panelists is getting them to think about at what stage of the learning process learners would be able to expect it to answer an item correctly. And then they had to actually make finer grained judgments, not just the judged CFR level of the items, but the actual at what point pre-A1, minimally competent A1, or minimally competent A2 plus, which, you know, these plus levels are verbally described in the CFR, would candidates be able to would be expected to answer an item correctly. And you can, by averaging out the panelists' judgments, you can come up with some kind of probability of each item being answered correctly at each level. And then from there, we can see how we can set provisional cut scores for a new test, for example, or in terms of how many raw scores on the test the students should be able to answer correctly to be deemed at a certain level. Right, so in terms of test design, I'd like to just talk about multi-stage adaptive tests, because they are just more efficient ways of finding out the level of a learner, especially in contexts where the test purpose is placement, for example, placing students on the right course that they should follow. So we need, and also multi-stage tests are good, because instead of setting 6 or 5 cut scores, as in the 6 levels of the CFR, multi-stage tests by nature, they allow just to set one cut score in the last stage of the test, so the learners are routed to the correct level of the the correct level of tasks, and they take tasks around their actual competence and ability. So the final decision at the final level is actually, is this learner either just pre-A1 or has already achieved A1 score? So it is a much more high mark. Am I running out of time? Yeah, this is the last one. Much more efficient way of finding out, and much more accurate and reliable and efficient way of finding the level of a learner. Okay, and my last slide is that you need to do internal validation checks, and that's it. Really, I don't want to talk about so just a summary really is that the CFR is very useful in young learners assessment for target setting and tracking progress. It also, the new companion volume defines new constructs which can be assessed in innovative ways, and I'm looking forward to lots of tests which and lots of syllabuses which actually incorporate mediation and online interaction in their syllabuses. And research on empirically validated longitudinal learning sequences is needed because we need them for what to emphasize and how to sequence our teaching and assessment, and how much we expect young learners to be able to achieve. And then assessment should make learning as effective as possible. It should be challenging, but not too frustrating for young learners. It should have diagnostic power, focus on the sweet spot where the learner is at the moment. So multi-stage adaptive tests are really good for this, and address difficult areas for each child, but not too difficult, not too frustrating. And cut scores need to be set by expert panels. And expert panels, every single member of the panel should be familiar with young learners, how they learn, either in terms of teaching or examining or developing tests for them, writing tests for them. And reporting of results, which I didn't talk about, should be made more helpful for young learners and their parents. Thank you.
Thanks, Szilvia. Wow, you covered a lot of ground.
I did, yeah, and I've got references, and then I've got lots of tasks as well. I can make the PDF available.